In this video, I'm going to look at another album that never was, and this is a follow-up to my album I did called Beatles 70, and that album would have been the album presumably that could have come out instead of them breaking up, and unfortunately they broke up. So I'm going to do one more album that caps their career that would have come out after that one, and we're going to look at that here on Pop Goes the 60s. I think 1970 was the proper time for the Beatles to end. And had they been able to patch up some business differences, they might have been able to end it with a little more class and a little more dignity. And these two albums I'm doing is an attempt to show what maybe could have been. So it's really difficult to create an album cover of four guys who were never in the same room together after 1969, which apparently was the case with the Beatles. This is what I did for the Beatles 70. This is a composite photo. So with the Beatles, the next album I'm doing here, I'm reverting to the Beatles' own nostalgia. Remember the Beatles albums, the second album, the American cheesy looking cover? Well, it was fairly easy to do what I'm calling the Beatles' Last album. And I think this is a proper way to cap off their career. And we've got electrifying big beat performances by England's Paul McCartney, John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, featuring Imagine, My Sweet Lord, and Uncle Albert. So we got three big hits off of this album, not unlike the one that came out back in '64. So for this album, I used the same formula that I used when I created the Beatles 70, and that is to give George Harrison equal amount of songs. On this particular album, since Ringo only chipped in one song, that left an open track, so who gets it? I gave it to George. So George actually has one more song than either John or Paul in this compilation. So before we look into the track listing, I want to just go over the photos that I chose for this here. So one of these I created another composite photo, but generally these are all photos from the 1969-1970 era. And this was a pretty easy album to do because they're all mostly single photos of the Beatles, a couple group shots. Same goes for the back of the album. And these are all just black and white. Obviously the front is sepia tone. Boy, Capitol really went on the cheap when they did this back in '64. So I followed suit and we just added black and white photos to the end here. A couple of these are from 1970, the John and Paul photos here. And we have one of the famous meetings here, Apple meetings with the four of the band there too. So I think those are fitting photos for this record. Let me read you the liner notes here. They're not really liner notes, but just the hype on the back, similar to the original album in '64. Here it says, "Never before has show business seen and heard anything like them. Here they are, one final time. The world's most popular foursome, singing and playing their collection of new hits, the Beatles' Last album." So let's look at the track listing of this record. One of the great things about this period of the Beatles, the ex-Beatles, there were some really great songs that they came out of the gate with when they started their solo careers. And one of my favorites is Imagine by John Lennon. That starts off this collection. It sounds very Beatley to me, and I think would have been maybe their last great big hit. And a great message and simple, like a lot of the Beatles songs. Following Imagine, we have Paul's Uncle Albert, Admiral Halsey. Now, I always thought this was a very good song and his first #1 single as a solo artist. And it gets a little bit cheeky at the end, but it's also, I could see the Beatles doing it and giving it more of an edge than Paul did. Okay, following this song is a favorite George Harrison song of mine that's somewhat obscure. It's called Deep Blue, and this was the B-side of Bangladesh. And it's a little bit bluesy, but acoustic. And apparently he was writing this when his parents were both dying in the hospital. And this is another song that sounds Beatley to me that maybe is a little bit derivative from For You Blue. Next up, John's Isolation. One of his great tracks off of his first solo album, Plastic Ono Band. It's one of his confessional songs, but I thought would have made a great Beatle track as well. Following up Isolation, we have Paul's Eat at Home from the Ram album. Now, Eat at Home I thought was just a great down-home song, and you could tell Paul had a great time recording it. And it seems like it's a song that John, George, and Ringo would have totally got into if they recorded that song. Next up, we have the big hit by George, What Is Life? This was a song that I thought could have been a hit in any part of the '70s, and it was the follow-up to My Sweet Lord. And obviously it was a big hit. That also hit #10. Now we're going to wind up side one with a Ringo song, and this is an obscure one called Blind Man, Blind Man was the B-side of, I think, Back Off Boogaloo, and it was intended for a film that he was working on that was never used. This song, for Ringo, I mean, this actually has a little bit of a psychedelic feel to it. And it's a self-penned song by Ringo, so that's why I put it on here. End of side one. Side two opens with My Sweet Lord. I think this is the biggest hit song any of the ex-Beatles ever had, and it was from George's All Things Must Pass. This song, I don't know what you think. I think this could have made a great Beatles song. Some people think it's too religious. I disagree. I could hear the Beatles singing the backing, much like Hey Jude fades out. So I think it's just a bright song. It's a fun song, and like I said, it was George's biggest hit. Next up, we have Oh Woman, Oh Why. This is Paul's B-side to Another Day. Oh Woman, Oh Why is one of his great early rockers, and this would have fit great on Abbey Road if they chose to record it then. If it was written then, great song, great instrumentation. Coming up next, we have Waiting on You All by George. Now this was off of All Things Must Pass, but the version I prefer is the stripped down version that was released not too long ago, that doesn't have all the heavy Phil Spector wall of sound on it. And this song, I think it's a very good song, and I thought that George would have been better served had that wall of sound not been there. We would have heard more George and less wall of sound. Following Waiting on You All is Gimme Some Truth from John's Imagine album. Now Gimme Some Truth was demoed briefly a couple times during the Get Back Let It Be sessions, and it seems to me they could have fleshed that out a little bit at that time. That also would have been a great contender for Abbey Road, but here we find it on the Beatles' last album.
No freaked out, yellow-bellied son of Gary Cooper gonna... Yeah. It's just money for rope.
I'm sick and tired of rearing lines by seasick, narrow-minded truth, hypocrite. All I want is the truth. We should change it as dim as the truth. I've had enough of reading lines.
Heart of the Country is next. This is a great Paul song. I've always liked this song. It's simple, another great melody from Paul, and doesn't take itself too seriously, and he's having fun with it. Another song I thought the Beatles would have been easy for them to record and easy for the other three to get into. Following Heart of the Country, we have Jealous Guy by John Lennon. Now this song had been around for a couple years, having been written in India in 1968 from a lecture that Maharishi gave on Child of Nature. And Paul McCartney wrote Mother Nature's Son from the same lecture. So by the time 1970-71 came around, John Lennon had changed the lyrics drastically and came up with Jealous Guy. It's a very nice melody. It rivals any of the Paul melodies, and this is the second last song here. So now we have the Beatles' closing song, and what I'm proposing is their last album. So how do you close this collection? And I chose Isn't It a Pity by George. And this song is I think it's a great album closer. It's got a long fade out a la Hey Jude, and it is a bit of a pity that the Beatles did break up. And I guess it had to happen, but Isn't It a Pity was a song that George had written while with the Beatles and was sitting around, and it was never recorded. And kind of a downer of a song, I suppose, which is maybe why it wasn't considered initially, but I think it's appropriate for the closing of the Beatles' last album. So if you want to give this album a listen, I have a Spotify playlist below. And you may want to check out my podcast where you can listen to it cross-fading into one another, and it's more of an album experience if you want to give that a listen as well. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of Albums That Never Were. I always am interested to hear and to see what other people would do as their final Beatle album. So put your list below. I'd love to see it, and there are no wrong answers. So give it a go, and we'll see you next time here on Pop Goes the 60s.
The beauty that surrounds them. Oh, isn't it a pity?